Hello and welcome to Preview Percy's look at Sheffield United for those of you who can't be bothered to read. This Friday's match kicks off at 8 p.m. up in Sheffield, of course, and we should give a brief and rare hats off to the owners for laying on free coach travel for all those who have tickets. Of course, in any sane and ordered world where supporters actually counted for something, TV companies would be banned from rearranging matches to dates or times that make it impossible for away supporters to get back by train in the first place. Still can't have everything, I suppose. So, what of Sheffield United? Well, they're currently in 8th place with 29 points from the 21 games they've played so far. That's a point behind Spurs and Wolves and 2 points behind Manchester United in the race for the not quite as good as you thought when you get their Thursday night league slot. Despite their solid return to the top flight, they haven't actually won in 3 matches, and a defeat this weekend would see them having lost 3 on the spin, though admittedly the other 2 were away defeats to Liverpool and Manchester City. The third game in their unproductive streak was a 1-1 draw at home to Watford. In amongst all that, they made 11 changes for the Cup, beating AFC Fylde to draw an away trip to Millwall in the We Hate West Ham More Than You derby. The good news is that Daisy, my full-time personal assistant with a beautiful smile, is now talking to me again after I made a tweet that was slightly less than complimentary about Kent, which happens to be the county of her origin, last week. Daisy informs me that, quiet as the transfer window has been, they've actually made 1 signing so far in the form of Jack Rodwell. Going back a few years, Rodwell was seen as something of a wonder kid when he came through the ranks at Everton, so much so that Manchester City were impressed enough to shell out £12 million for him back in 2012. However, a couple of years and he'd failed to make much of a mark up there, so after little more than a handful of games, he left for Sunderland. Now, there are not many clubs that are palpably worse off than us in terms of the ownership stakes, but Sunderland are definitely one of them. They were daft enough to sign up for one of those fly-on-the-wall documentaries around the time that Rodwell was with them, and he unwittingly became the star or villain, depending on your point of view, of the piece, as Sunderland descended through the leagues. Rodwell was on a rumoured £70,000 a week in the Championship, and the club asked him if he wouldn't mind awfully tearing up that contract on account of them not being in the Premiership anymore. Perhaps understandably, Rodwell declined the club's kind offer of a 100% pay cut and told them that, on reflection, he'd rather prefer it if they could stick to the original arrangement whereby he turned up on time for training every day and the club paid him. This annoyed the club to the extent that they unleashed the ultimate sanction of making him train with the under-23 squad. I'm sure that really stung him as he looked at his pay slip with a figure of £70,000 displayed at the top. Rodwell arrives as a free agent, having been released by Blackburn at the end of last season. Rodwell made his debut for Sheffield United in a cup match at the weekend. This was a match that also saw a rare first-team outing for Ravel Morrison. Morrison was described by Sam Allardyce as the biggest waste of talent that he'd ever worked with. It's a sobering thought to consider that the player who was capable of that goal at Spurs is currently making up the numbers for cup matches in Yorkshire at the grand old age of 26. Top scorer at present is French under-21 international Lys Mousset. Mousset has 6 goals from the 17 league appearances he's made this season, a stat made slightly more interesting when you consider that he hasn't been an automatic first choice. 10 of those 17 appearances have come from the bench, including the equaliser he scored at the Olympic Stadium back in October. That was a goal he scored only a few minutes after he'd entered the pitch. Second top scorer is Ollie McBurney. McBurney's got 3 so far this season. When last we met, he'd just been arrested for drink driving, with his case due before the magistrates early in November. The case was heard, and despite the police stating that McBurney had registered something like 1.5 times the legal limit for alcohol in his bloodstream, he pleaded not guilty. His defence appears to be that he'd only had 1 drink, and so that his blood alcohol level couldn't possibly have been that high, which is a disappointingly unoriginal and usually unsuccessful line of defence in my experience. They have a fairly full squad to pick from Friday night, although there may be a few storm counts gathering on the goalkeeping front. Their first choice custodian, Dean Henderson, is fit, but they may be struggling to find someone to cover for him on the bench. Michael Verrips, who you'll be pleased to know has Dutch caps at youth level, managed to bump into a teammate during the Fylde Cup tie and was later found claiming on social media that he'd been concussed. If that's confirmed by a proper doctor, the rules on such matters will prevent him from taking any part in the match. Their usual number 2, number 1, if you get my meaning, is Simon Moore, but he's been struggling with a hip injury. The thing is, of course, that now we've got Fabianski back and fit for us, and with the possible return of Darren Randolph to the fold, we're likely to have a spare keeper floating around if they want one. Just a thought. And so we move on to our regular look at the wild and wacky world of association football. And we're moving on to Sunderland, whose current owners have said they'll listen to offers for the club, citing supporter pressure for the move. It's a nice thought, I suppose, though I suspect it only works with club owners with skins slightly less thin than the average rhino. Meanwhile, a video showing Declan Rice's car getting wheel clamped has been banned by the Advertising Standards Authority on the grounds that betting adverts aren't supposed to feature anybody under 25 years old. The club sponsors argued that it wasn't an advert, it was just pure coincidence that their logo was all over the place, which was a line of argument even less convincing than McBurney's "I only had one drink" defence. Meanwhile, Stuart Pearce has said his possible return to our coaching staff has been blocked by the owners because of criticism he made the last time he left. You're in good company, Stuart. And so we move on to the events of last weekend. And the trip to Gillingham, well, it was a classic game of two halves, really. Moyes used the match to experiment with his favoured three at the back formation. However, for the first 45 minutes, our wing-backs in the form of Fredericks and Masuaku seemed very reluctant to occupy the space forward of where they've been used to be playing. In effect, we seemed to be playing with a back five, something that gave up numbers and initiative in midfield to the home side. Presumably issued by some form of rocket in the second half, the two wing-backs actually played as wing-backs, pushed on up wide, and eventually the numbers and class told. The win was not without its cost, mind. Fredericks has succumbed to the hamstring epidemic that is affecting Antonio and Yarmolenko, and whilst Zabaleta is a wily old fox and he'll have loved his goal on Sunday, he isn't the ideal wing-back by any stretch of the imagination. We're looking at February before we'll see Fredericks again. Similarly, some chap called Wilshere is slated for a potential return at the same time. Martin and Yarmolenko are definitely out this weekend. Noble and Cresswell both have a 75% chance of being involved, whilst the aforementioned Antonio is rated as 50-50. With all due respect to Bournemouth, who are on a particularly steep downward slide, and Gillingham, who, let's face it, are two divisions below us, this weekend represents the first proper test for the Moyes regime. The two wins will have helped steady morale, of course, but there should be few illusions that this will be much tougher. However, on the small amount of evidence so far, there are positives, and that can be carried forward into this one. I'd say that on Sunday, my suspicion is that had Pellegrini still been in charge, the second half would have been left to meander much in the same way as the first had drifted. My gut tells me that we'll graft a lot harder in this one, and I reckon a share of the points is not beyond the bounds of possibility. So the £2.50 that I'm not being allowed to spend on drink at the moment will instead be placed on a wager that the game will end in a, let's say, 2-2 draw. Make it so, Mr. Winson. Enjoy the game, and if you want to know what happened last time we met, who the referee is, who their danger man is, and of course, if you want to take part in Percy's Poser, please go to kumb.com, where you can actually have somebody read it to you if you're that dim.